Don't call us homers for the SEC. We're not the ones with 9 SEC teams in a preseason top 25. That would be 24/7 Sports. We will react to their preseason top 25 today on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, this is the time of the year where we get the post-spring preseason top 25s. Of course, January is the time you get the quote-unquote too early preseason top 25s. And now it gets to the stage where I don't think it is too early because rosters are almost set. There will be, a couple more comings and goings before summer camp, but for the most part, we know teams' rosters, the coaching carousel has stopped, and we got a pretty good idea of teams' season outlook. And recently, 24/7 Sports updated their preseason top 25, and we'll get into the SEC teams in it. But first off, John, kind of a sweeping overview. 9 SEC teams not only are in their top 25, they're in their top 20. But interestingly, it's not an SEC team at the top. Georgia's number 2, Texas number 3, but Ohio State number 1. Oregon rounds out the top 4, which would have been more relevant in the era of a 4-team playoff, but still interesting. So what's your take as you kind of look at the top end of that ranking before we start to get into these SEC teams individually?
I think every top 25 poll predating before the AP and coaches poll come out, and I think they will follow suit, we'll have either Ohio State or Georgia 1, 2. The advantage I give to Georgia is not just my affiliation with an SEC Unfiltered podcast. It's quarterback. I still like Georgia's situation a little better than Ohio State. It's breaking in a new guy, Will Howard from Kansas State. I think that could be an upgrade over last season. But I still like Georgia because of that. But I really think it's a toss-up, whichever one you want to pick. And we think of Ohio State as only pretty much having to beat Michigan to get into the playoff. Georgia's schedule is a little more demanding than it's been, certainly more so than last year. It'll have a tougher path to the playoffs. But again, you got 12 teams in there, so Georgia doesn't have to go unbeaten or even finish 11-1 to make the playoff.
Yeah, I wrote recently for our SEC Unfiltered newsletter, John, that I think it's plausible, maybe not likely, I'm not necessarily predicting this, but I think it's very plausible that Georgia could go like 10-2, get about an 8 seed in the 12-team playoff and be the 8 seed nobody wants to face and run to the national championship. I mean, you look at that schedule, that everybody looks at the game against Alabama. Yeah, okay, they got to go to Alabama, but they also play Texas. They play Ole Miss. They play Tennessee. Some of the best teams in this conference are on Georgia's schedule this year, and it really marks a bit of a 180 from last year. Last year, they had a pretty cupcake-filled schedule, and then they lost to Alabama in the SEC championship game, and they're just on the outside looking into the 4-team playoff, and that was the reality of the 4-team playoff, right? If you lose even one game, you leave yourself vulnerable. You leave 2 games, you're out. Now, you could lose 2 games, and you're not going to get a first-round bye, probably, but you could still wind up even hosting a first-round playoff game and being a very dangerous team. And I think that's certainly a possibility for Georgia when we consider how tough their schedule is.
I agree, Blake. You look at a Georgia schedule too, and you go 10-2 with that schedule, you're in the playoff. There's just no way you wouldn't make the playoff. And okay, so maybe you wouldn't get a bye, but in effect, you would get a bye because you wouldn't be playing in the SEC championship game. And if you're playing in that game, you're playing one of the best teams in the country. So I don't think that's such a detriment to Georgia's cause. If it gets in at 10-2, and when you mention all these teams, 9 in the top 20 from the SEC, think what that does for strength of schedule. It just gives everybody a chance. I think most of these schools are looking at this as 10-2. 10-2 is our path to the playoff. I mean, it's not about going unbeaten or making the SEC championship game or going 11-1 or being ranked in the top 4. It's probably about 10-2. And I think you could, with this, looking at these schedules, I think there are going to be 4 SEC teams in pretty much for sure. And maybe you can't discount the possibility of 5 teams. What if you ended up with 5, 10-2 teams from the conference?
Yeah,
How
I
could you
think you would.
eliminate one of them?
I think you would probably have 5 SEC qualifiers at that point. And you make a
Sure.
good point about being 10-2 and missing the SEC championship game. John, I still think the ideal path, of course, is to win the conference championship game, get the first round bye. However, you raise a good argument there that if you're not going to win the conference crown, there is a theory, and Kirby Smart even sort of hinted at this a year ago at SEC spring meetings. There's a theory that you might actually be better off finishing 3rd in the SEC than you would be to be the SEC's runner-up, losing in that conference championship game. Because if you finish 3rd in the conference, you're almost certainly going to make the playoff. You get what equates to a bye week, an open date, while everybody else is playing their conference championship games. Come in well rested the following week into your first round playoff game. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that Kirby Smart's sitting here in the offseason preaching to his team, let's lose 2 games and finish in 3rd place in the SEC standings. But to that point, 10-2 with a schedule like Georgia's, with a schedule like a lot of these SEC teams are going to play this year, would put you in, is still in pretty good position, and not only being in the first round of the playoff, but maybe even hosting a first round playoff game. So let's get into these 9 teams in this 24/7 Sports Top 25, John, and we'll do too high, too low, or just right. A little Goldilocks inspired reaction to these rankings. So we've been talking about Georgia, so let's start there. Georgia at number 2. They're 1 spot ahead of Texas. They're 1 spot behind of Ohio State, so they can only go up 1 spot. Do you think they are too high at number 2? Are they ranked too low, or do you think they're just right there at number 2?
I would, if I were doing a top 25, I'd have Georgia number 1 over Ohio State because of the quarterback. But I'm not really going to quibble with 1 or 2 there for Georgia and Ohio State. If I had Georgia number 1, I would have Ohio State number 2. So I can't really argue vehemently about that.
Yeah, I think I'd go the same way. I would probably have Georgia number 1 for similar reasoning to you. I might like Ohio State's overall depth chart a little bit better than Georgia's, although it's pretty close. But when you think about some of the players Ohio State added through the transfer portal, they got Caleb Downs, the star safety from Alabama. They got Quinshon Judkins, the standout running back from Ole Miss. But I do come back to quarterback. It's so important. And as you mentioned, I mean, Carson Beck is a returning star there for Georgia. Will Howard from Kansas State had a pretty nice run at his former school, but it will be a step up to quarterbacking what some believe will be the number 1 team in the country. So I would, because of the quarterback situation, I would lean Georgia at number 1 as well. Although, as you mentioned, there's really not too much to argue about here because Georgia is ranked number 2 in this rankings. Let's move on to the next one, John. Texas. We still got to get used to associating Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC. But they claim one of the spots in this ranking. They are at number 3. Texas, really, of the 4 playoff qualifiers from last year, they returned the most. They returned their starting quarterback in Quinn Ewers. Of course, they got Arch Manning as the backup. They brought in some good transfer wide receivers, and notably, they are the only one of the 4 playoff qualifiers from last year to return their coach. Jim Harbaugh won the national championship, left. Alabama lost in the semifinals. Nick Saban retires. And then Kalen DeBoer, whose Washington team lost in the national championship, he replaces Alabama. So that's a little unusual there that 3 of the 4 teams from the playoff from last year have different coaches. I'm high on Texas, so I will say that I think this number 3 ranking is just right for Texas because I think Texas is not going to backslide much, if at all, from last year. And last year they were a playoff semifinal team, so I think they're appropriately ranked at number 3. What do you think?
I would probably have Texas a little lower. I don't have a huge problem with it being third. I wonder how Texas will adjust to an SEC schedule. One of the things that I think makes the SEC so difficult is that you play what you might consider lesser teams, and sometimes, and maybe think you're going to have an easy go of it. And that's so often that's not the case. With the SEC, you don't know where your problems might be coming from. I mean, you can look up and think Georgia, Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas, sure. But then there are other teams in the middle of the league and even in the lower half that can jump up and upset a team on a given Saturday. You didn't have that depth of talent in the Big 12. I think Texas's challenge will be to adjust to that and realize you've got a thin margin for error there, and you got to be on your game pretty much every Saturday. If not, you could be in trouble.
All right, so you have them a smidge high, but it doesn't sound like you would have them too much lower in your rankings. Here's an interesting one next from the SEC. So Oregon was number 4 in these rankings. We'll breeze past the Ducks, who do have some SEC presence on their team. They got former A&M wide receiver Evan Stewart, and then Oklahoma becomes an SEC newcomer this year without Dillon Gabriel. He's replacing Bo Nix as the starting quarterback there at Oregon. But let's get to the number 5 team in these rankings, John. I was a little surprised to see this one, although maybe I shouldn't be. Alabama always gets love in preseason rankings, but I thought there might be a little bit more pause with Bama in the preseason polls this year without Nick Saban. But no, not in this ranking. Alabama, the preseason number 5 from 24/7 Sports. What do you think about this ranking? And were you, like me, initially surprised at all to see Alabama within the top 5 in these preseason rankings?
Agreed. I was a little surprised, and as you said, maybe we shouldn't be. It's almost a muscle memory takes over there, and you're used to writing Alabama, usually higher than 5 in the preseason poll. Alabama's going through a big transition. I mean, everything was in place with Nick Saban. You knew exactly what to expect. The players knew, the assistants knew. It was business as usual. Didn't win a national championship last year, but made the playoff and acquitted itself well enough in the semifinal game it lost. So I just look at Alabama kind of the same way I did the last year in particular. Where are its big plays coming from? Jalen Milroe, the quarterback, okay, but who else? They've got some young running backs, and I think that might be the key for Alabama. If those younger running backs come through and become that star running back. Otherwise, I just don't see that many playoffs. And I think when you play makers, and when you talk about making the playoffs, those crucial games that determine that, it often comes down to somebody making a big play. And other than Jalen Milroe, I don't know if Alabama has that. But I thought the same thing last year, and it ended up in the Final Four. So maybe I'm overly concerned about that. But I do think other teams have better big play guys than Alabama.
Yeah, and the other thing I wonder about with Alabama, John, they lost so much in the back end of their defense. Caleb Downs, Terrion Arnold, Kool-Aid McKinstry. It is really a new look secondary. And also, they lost Dallas Turner, Chris Braswell, their edge rushers. I mean, there are some significant departures on defense. I mean, that defense isn't going to fall off a cliff. There's still talent over there, but I don't think it's the Alabama defense from the pinnacle of the dynasty days. And I also don't think, and you were alluding to this, I don't think this is like the offense from 2020 either. I like Jalen Milroe. I think he can take a step forward with Kalen DeBoer, but I think Jalen Milroe could take a step forward in his personal development and his growth as a quarterback, and still, I think this number 5 ranking is a little too high for Alabama because of those issues I raised on defense. I mean, if there's Caleb Downs and some of those others in the back end of that defense, and a really proven unit in the secondary, I might feel differently. But with so many new faces in the back end and losing their pass rushers that had proven themselves and become reliable last year, I think I have too many concerns about what I think will still be a good defense, but not a dominant defense. And so I think number 5 is too high for Alabama.
Well, and you point out the secondary, which I agree is a concern. And talking about big plays earlier, that can lend itself to giving up big plays, busted assignments, missed tackles, getting beat one-on-one in the secondary. And Alabama's losing so many elite players. That was a crushing blow, I thought, Caleb Downs going to Ohio State. And another factor in the secondary I can't ignore, that was Nick Saban's position of expertise. That's what he coached as an assistant, and he was very involved with defensive backs. He really knew the nuances of the position, and he could call a guy aside, a cornerback or a safety, and really, because I've heard Alabama DBs talk about that, point out very little things that, very intricate things that might make them a better defender, better in coverage, better in tackling. So that, yeah, you couple that with maybe not as many playmakers as you would want, and I think that's too high for Alabama. Number 5 is too high.
All right, how about Ole Miss at number 6, John? We're still going to maybe have to adjust to seeing Ole Miss this high in the rankings, but it's a sign of what Lane Kiffin has built in Oxford. I think this is Lane's best roster he's ever assembled, not just at Ole Miss, really anywhere that he's coached. I don't think he's had a roster as good as the one he has this year. He was once again active in the transfer portal. By many accounts, he assembled the best transfer class in the country. That's not really a surprise with how well he does it there. He's continued to, I guess, be a little bit lukewarm toward high school recruiting because he knows he can get so much talent in the portal. And I think notably, a lot of his best, he got good players on both sides of the ball out of the portal. But what really impressed me was they got a lot of really good contributors on defense, including Walter Nolan, the defensive lineman from Texas A&M, who should be among the defenders who will be an impact player for Ole Miss from day one. So after all they added through the portal, knowing Jackson Dart is back again as a starting quarterback, what do you think about Ole Miss at number 6 in the rankings? Is this too high, or do you think they got this one right?
I actually would have Ole Miss higher.
Oh, wow.
If you had 4 teams in the playoff,
mm-hmm.
I'd pick Ole Miss to be one of them. I think this team is loaded. Lane Kiffin, we've questioned in the past about how he would do in the biggest games. I always remember Bobby Bowden saying the biggest games are the ones you don't win. They used to point at him for losing to Miami. That's the big game because you lost it. But I really think this team is set for a great season. Toughest game, Georgia. That's in Oxford. I think Ole Miss is ready to take this next step, and I think Lane Kiffin is too. You always wonder with transfers, an influx of transfers, how will they fit in with team chemistry? How will that work in the locker room? Maybe that's overstated, but by adding so many each of the last few seasons, and not just quantity but quality, it's almost made a transfer as a badge of honor, as though these guys there's unity already within the team of the transfers because they all come in here at Ole Miss, and there's a togetherness, I think, that breeds, and I don't see a whole lot wrong with this team.
I don't see a whole lot wrong with them either. I wouldn't probably have them higher than 6, but I wouldn't have them lower either. I think 6 is very fair. I think it's very realistic for Ole Miss to expect to be in the inaugural 12-team playoff. You've raised them. You were kind of at the vanguard of raising Ole Miss as one of the very top contenders of the SEC championship for this season. You even said that before Nick Saban retired, and now in the aftermath of Saban's retirement, Alabama had a few notable transfers leave. Isaiah Bond, the wide receiver, went to Texas. Caleb Downs, as we mentioned, went to Ohio State. I think your early prediction of having Ole Miss on the short list to make Atlanta is a good one. I still think it'll be Georgia and Texas probably, but Ole Miss is right there in that conversation. And with Georgia having to play at Texas this year, that doesn't necessarily knock one of them out of Atlanta, but whoever were to lose that game really leaves themselves no margin for error. So I think you're right to be high on Ole Miss. I am too. I would leave them right there at number 6. Okay, next, John. Curious to see how you react to this one because you've gotten whiplash being on and off the Missouri bandwagon. 24/7 Sports in this ranking, they are on the Missouri bandwagon. Yeah, they lost Cody Schrader, the star running back from last season. It's not going to be easy to replace his production, and yet elsewhere on Missouri's roster, they bring a ton back, including quarterback Brady Cook, including star wide receiver Luther Burden. Among SEC teams, they are at the top end of the conference in terms of returning production. Texas is very comparable with them. They return a ton of production too, much like Missouri does. And they are getting credit in this rankings all the way up at number 8. What do you think about this?
Well, I think I had Missouri picked to maybe finish 6th or 7th in the, I guess 6. I had them picked to finish 6th in 2023, and they had a remarkable season, I thought. So I completely changed my opinion. I also changed my opinion on Eli Drinkwitz, the coach. I thought he was probably the most overpaid coach in the country going into last season. Changed my mind about that. Just a really nice job. I think that's about right. If I didn't see the schedule, I would say it's too high. But when I look at Missouri's schedule, that's one of the more accommodating schedules I've ever seen for an SEC contender. We say contender now, not so much for a championship, but for a playoff berth. And so I don't think that's overstated. You've got a really good quarterback at Missouri, a proven wide receiver, one of the best in the country, in Luther Burden. But I'm with you on that Cody Schrader. I just thought, if you go by the NFL draft, what's the big deal? He signed as a free agent, but I thought he was a tremendous college football player. I loved watching him play, breaking tackle after tackle. Missouri has a void at that position, and maybe they'll fill it. But that's the only reason I think it won't make the playoff. I'm just not sure if its offense will be balanced enough. Brady Cook is a good runner too, but it's easier to run when you can fake a handoff to Cody Schrader or a back of his caliber. So that's the only real question I have.
So you think they're did I hear this right? You think they're appropriately ranked here in the preseason at number 8, but you're skeptical whether they can make the playoff.
Yeah, I think 8's about right because of an easy schedule. But I mean, if it finished 15th, that wouldn't shock me.
Yeah, I mean, part of the key to their season is going to be Marcus Carroll. He's the transfer running back from Georgia State, rushed for over 1,300 yards last year. Now, of course, that's obviously a different level. He's stepping up to the SEC, but we talked about the departure of Cody Schrader, whom himself was a transfer from a lower level, transferred from Division II and was a walk-on, and then became so good that Eli Drinkwitz couldn't keep him off the field, and now they're sort of hoping that strikes again with Marcus Carroll. Like I said, the graduate transfer from Georgia State. I like this number 8 ranking for Missouri. At first, I want to say too high, but when I look at what they bring back off what was a really good team last year, I try not to think too much about the schedule when I form preseason rankings because I don't necessarily think preseason rankings should be predictive of the season to come, right? I think preseason rankings are just going into the season. I rank the teams that I think are the best, regardless of what their schedule looks like. But it's hard, at least on a subconscious level, not to have that Missouri schedule in mind and think, boy, this is really accommodating to like a 10-2 type of season.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think I really don't have much issue with this. I think number 8 for Missouri's about right, and I think they'll be a playoff contender. I think they definitely need to win 10 games with that schedule. Most SEC teams, I think, win 10 and you're in, and there's not going to be much bickering or debate about it. With Missouri's schedule, depending on what happens elsewhere, Missouri could still find itself a little bit on the bubble with a 10-2 record with that schedule because it's not nearly as strong as some others in the SEC. But I don't know. I'd still take my chances. If you tell me at the beginning of the season you're going to go 10-2, I'd take my chances that I'm getting in the playoff with that record.
Yeah, and I do it a little bit differently. For when I pick a top 25 in preseason, I pick it based on how I think the teams will finish,
Okay.
as opposed who's the best team. So I am factoring schedule in that. I mean, if Missouri were playing a really staunch schedule, I probably wouldn't have it that high. And I didn't have it that high in my mind until I looked at its schedule, because I was thinking, yeah, people are really rating Missouri a bit higher than I thought they would. And then I saw the schedule and I quickly understood why.
All right, moving on. That's the first 5 SEC teams there. Five of the top 8 in these rankings are SEC teams, and we really haven't had too much argument with many of them, other than we think Alabama is a touch high. Although fair to say, we both have Alabama in our top 10. John, I mean, how
Oh,
much?
yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So we'd have each of these teams in our top 10 at the very least. Moving on, we have Tennessee at number 12 in these preseason rankings. What do you think about that as Tennessee hands the reins to who will be redshirt freshman quarterback Nico Iamaleava? We saw him get his first career start in Tennessee's bowl victory against Iowa. Looked good. I don't think there's really any concern that this guy's not going to be living up to his hype, his ranking. Well, it might be hard to live up to the hype considering he was the nation's number 1 overall recruit. But I don't think anybody's worried about this guy being a bust. He looks like the real deal, and I think at some point this season there's going to be Vols fans wondering why wasn't this guy starting last year. But there are questions elsewhere. There's always a question with Tennessee usually under Josh Heupel is how good's that defense going to be. So what do you think about having Tennessee here at number 10?
I think it's
Excuse me, number 12, John.
12. Yeah, I think
Number
it's
12.
too low. I think Tennessee is definitely a top 10 team. I think Tennessee can make the playoff. Part of that is for the same reason I have Missouri as a possible playoff team. Tennessee's schedule is not that demanding. You look at it and say Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, but this isn't the Oklahoma of old. Alabama's in a coaching transition. And so it's really Georgia. I could see Tennessee being favored in all but one game going into the season. I think it could be favored at home against Alabama and even on the road at Oklahoma. I have a lot of questions about Oklahoma. So, yeah, I think that's too low. So I guess if I were doing my top 10, I would have 6 SEC teams in the top 10.
All right. Well, SEC homerism there, John, do you think?
I try to fight against that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just the straight truth. I mean, it's not homerism. That's
Yeah.
just reality.
No. Yeah, it's
Okay.
just fact. Just the facts.
I mean, it might be. I really don't have a huge argument against that. But I would not have Tennessee higher. I think Nico is going to be fine, but they lost their top running back, Jalen Wright, off last season. My biggest question though is defense. Is this defense going to be competent enough for this to be a playoff team, or is it going to be they rely on Nico and the offense to go about 9-3, and they're just on the outside looking in? I could see it going either way. I mean, I think they are certainly a playoff contender. They'll be dancing around that conversation. Don't know that they beat Georgia. I think they struggle. could struggle against either Alabama or Oklahoma. Even if you win one out of those two and lose to Georgia, that then leaves you no margin for error. And we know the past couple seasons, Tennessee has stubbed its toe a couple times. They went on the road and lost to South Carolina a couple years ago, cost them a shot at the playoff, and then they got trounced on the road at Missouri last year. So I just wonder if that defense, at some point is going to flare up as being vulnerable and they lose a game that maybe we didn't anticipate them losing coming into the season. Although you make a good point, there's only so many candidates for that on the schedule, because this is, along with Missouri, one of the more accommodating schedules in the country. But I think 9-3 is very realistic for Tennessee. I think they'll be in the hunt for 10-2 in a playoff spot. So I think having them right at number 12 is a pretty good place for them. Which brings us one spot down to the next team in these rankings, and that is LSU at number 13. Now, we talked about LSU last week on the podcast after my conversation with Brian Kelly. LSU's third-year coach is banking on his defense being markedly better this season. And it'll have to be, because that defense was an absolute bust last year. Brian Kelly overhauled the coaching staff, brought in new defensive coordinator Blake Baker from Missouri, brought in some other veterans on his coaching staff as well. Brian Kelly trusts what he's got at quarterback there. It's not going to be Jayden Daniels 2.0, but Garrett Nussmeier, we've seen flashes of talent from him, but they don't just lose the quarterback. They lost 2 star wide receivers as well. So it is a bit of a transition there at Baton Rouge. We know they still have talent. What do you think about them being ranked here at number 13?
I think that's about right. I still have concerns about LSU's defense. Yeah, it could be better. In fact, how could it be worse?
Right.
I mean, so sure, it could be better. Just giving Harold Perkins a different role and make it better. But I'm still not sold on this defense. And I like Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback. He's a good passer, but he can't do what Jayden Daniels did. I mean, Jayden Daniels was such an explosive open field runner. I mean, he gets past the line and you don't know if anybody will be able to tackle the guy. He's so shifty and he has speed. So I just think LSU would struggle to do better than that. I think if LSU could go 9-3 and finish 13th, that would be pretty good.
I think 13's about right too, for all the reasons you mentioned. I'm not totally sold on defensive improvement. Like you, I think it's going to be hard to be much worse. I think they could be a little bit better, but you could be a little bit better on defense and a little bit worse on offense and be right where you were last year, which is around a 9-3 season. I think there's momentum in that program. I think there would be a tendency maybe to have an overreaction if LSU misses the playoff here in Brian Kelly's third season. And I would understand that criticism. However, I would say let's continue to monitor what's happening on the recruiting trail as well, because right now LSU's got a really, really good recruiting class shaping up for this next signing class, including the nation's #1 overall quarterback prospect. So, yeah, I think the expectation at LSU is to make the playoff. I think they're going to be in the hunt. I don't know if they get it done, but I do think 13 is about right in the rankings. Now, here's a team, John, that you've been raising some concerns about throughout the offseason. Apparently, 24/7 Sports doesn't feel as much concern about Oklahoma because the Sooners are number 15 in this preseason ranking. You think that's too high, too low, or about right?
Oh, I definitely think that's too high. Yeah, I do have questions about this team. I have questions about Brent Venables. Just finished his second year, going in his third season. When you start out with a losing season at Oklahoma, that does raise questions. Forget all the circumstances. It is Oklahoma, so you don't expect to see 7 losses. Then last season started out great, but faded. Loses Dylan Gabriel, I thought one of the best quarterbacks in the country, to Oregon as a transfer. Jackson Arnold, I like what I saw him in the bowl game. Very talented. I'm not as sure he'll have a typical high-end Oklahoma supporting cast around him. They're reworking the offensive line, and defensive issues always seem to crop up with Oklahoma lately. So the schedule is very difficult. I just I don't see Oklahoma finishing in 15th, lower than that.
Yeah, I think
So
this is too high too. I feel probably better about Oklahoma's defense than I do its offense. You're right. I mean, historically, defense has been a continued bugaboo for Oklahoma, but they got a lot of guys back on that side of the ball. I think that unit will be okay, and it was already making some strides last year. There were still a few flare-up games for that defense, but it was a little bit better last year. But I wonder about the transition from Dylan Gabriel to Jackson Arnold. I know Jackson Arnold is very talented. Had the recruiting profile. He he threw for a lot of yards, but also 3 interceptions in that bowl game loss to Arizona. But the biggest thing I wonder about is just going to a largely untested quarterback, a guy with one career start, still early in his career, and adding to the fact that you're in a new conference. I think that is sort of a 1-2 punch a little bit. You're losing Dylan Gabriel. You're going to a youngster at quarterback who might be good in time, but I think there could be some growing pains with him. And then you add in the overall growing pains with being in a new conference. Yeah, I think 15 is definitely too high for Oklahoma. I agree with you.
another factor with Oklahoma in the SEC its first year, I really think SEC teams, the old guard, are going to get really pumped up to play Oklahoma and Texas. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, both of those historic programs, Oklahoma's won a lot of championships, one of the most successful programs in college football history. Just the name alone, when Oklahoma is playing maybe lesser teams, I think those lesser teams are going to want to prove to them, okay, we're going to show you what SEC football is about. Uh, and Oklahoma may be up to the challenge, but I think it's going to be surprised at how many challenges crop up in the course of the season.
All right, last one in these rankings from the SEC, John. Under Jimbo Fisher, and even at times under Kevin Sumlin, Texas A&M was often a prime candidate to be among the overrated teams in the preseason. And here they are with a new coach, Mike Elko, ranked number 19 in these preseason rankings from 24/7 Sports after a season in which Jimbo Fisher was fired. Texas A&M lost some talent. We mentioned Walter Nolan now at Ole Miss, Evan Stewart now at Oregon. Elko did a reasonable job keeping some guys there. I mean, he could have lost much more than he did, but still, there were some notable departures. Connor Wigman, the quarterback, coming back off of injury. Do you think 19 is fair, or do you think that is too high? I'm guessing you don't think it's too low for A&M.
You know, I really have a hard time figuring out what A&M is going to do. I just uh, I usually go into a season thinking A&M will be better than it was, and then when it falls on its face, I think just another disappointment, another letdown. I overrated the Aggies, and then by the time the next season's rolled around, I look back on the previous season and think, well, yeah, I probably overrated them last season, but they weren't as bad is their record. I saw them just in enough games where they played well and demonstrated enough talent to make me think, yeah, maybe this is the year they put it together. Maybe a coaching change will help. So if A&M is in fact the 19th best team in the country, boy, this might be the strongest SEC we've ever seen.
So what is
Somebody's got to lose games in this league.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to load up these rankings with SEC and Big Ten teams because there's so many good programs from these conferences. But you're right, somebody's going to lose, and that means there's going to be some ACC and Big 12 teams out there with good records, and the top end of those conferences is still going to have some good teams that could compete with the middle of the conference, the SEC and Big Ten. I think that this ranking is too high. I think Mike Elko will, make a good first impression in year one. But I think a number 19 ranking would be a great first impression. If he would have retained a little bit more of that talent, even than he did, that he inherited, guys like Evan Stewart, then maybe I'd feel a little bit better at this 19. They could be chasing around the bottom of the top 25. I think that's realistic, but number 19 just feels a little high for first year coach, program still in transition. Am I hearing? Did you say just right? Too high? What's your verdict on this one, John?
I think it's a little high.
Okay.
When I look at A&M, I still don't know what to think about quarterback,
Mm-hmm.
and that's such a big factor in preseason rankings. So, is your quarterback in competent hands? You know you're going to be good at quarterback. That goes a long way in today's version of college football. Connor Wigman, I think he was a 5-star recruit. He's shown flashes, but he got hurt last year. He seemed to be playing better. How will he do? I'm not sure. Losing Evan Stewart was a blow because he's a playmaker and demands special attention from a secondary. But I do think Alabama A&M has run depth at running back, and that can go a long way in the SEC. But yeah, gosh, when I look at that, when I look at these rankings, a first impression, when I just see that many teams in the conference, 2 through 19, I'm just thinking, wow. It almost doesn't seem possible because, as I say, somebody's got to lose these games. You can't. Everybody can't win every Saturday.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the idea of getting 5 into the playoff, it's going to be difficult, but it's not going to be impossible. Getting more than 5, I think that's a stretch. But as we look at this, I think you and I both feel like there are 7 preseason playoff contenders from the SEC. That being Georgia, Texas, in no particular order: Georgia, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, Missouri, Tennessee, LSU. Those are the 7, I think,
Mm-hmm.
preseason playoff contenders. And then there's a little bit of a line of separation before you get to some of these other teams, like an Oklahoma, like a Texas A&M, kind of the middle of the conference. And then we feel like there's a bottom of the pack situation where you'll find Vanderbilt, where you'll find Mississippi State, South Carolina, Florida, those types of teams, right? We kind of
Yes.
see some different tiers forming. Playoff contenders, then middle of the pack of about 3 or 4 teams where it's like, yeah, you might have a nice season, but you're probably not going to seriously be in the hunt for the playoff, come mid-November. And then the bottom of the pack are teams that could be by November searching for a new coach.
Well, when we look at that top 19, all of those SEC teams in the top 19, when you put out rankings like that, you're assuming pretty much that these teams will win all the games they're supposed to win.
Mm-hmm.
And that just never happens. We talk, when you look at the middle of the SEC, I think there's a pretty clear dividing line between those 7 and the other 9, but that doesn't mean you're going to beat the other 9, because what will Oklahoma do, or what on a given day in Norman or Texas A&M and a great home field advantage in Aggie land. It's going to be such an interesting season. And we may look back on these rankings and say the whole league was overrated because these teams that we think, I see so many 10-2 teams. And those 10-2 teams might become 9-3 teams. And I think what will be interesting is, could a 9-3 team from the SEC, which is lost only to really good teams within the conference, could it have a shot at a playoff? It would be difficult, but I don't think it's impossible.
I think in the right year, it's possible. I think you could see, if the last at-large spot, say, comes down to a 9-3 SEC team or like a 10-2 Big 12, I could see the nod going to a 9-3 SEC team. It's sort of some of that's dependent on what happens in the Big Ten, because the flip side of these rankings are you have Ohio State at number 1, you have Oregon, Big Ten newcomer, at number 4, you have Michigan, despite the turnover on the coaching staff, at quarterback, etc. In Ann Arbor, you have Michigan at number 7. You have Penn State, whom I think is going to be pretty good. I know you're often cautious of Penn State for good reason, John, but I think this Penn State team is truly a playoff contender. Penn State is number 9 in these preseason rankings. So you have 4 from the Big Ten in the preseason top 10. Now, the question then, is there a 5th Big Ten team to sort of steal a bid? I don't know that there is. Like, I think all those 4 teams that we just mentioned, I would have them as preseason playoff hopefuls. I don't really have anybody that jumps out to me beyond those 4 that I think they've got a really good shot at making the playoff. Whereas I look at the SEC, and as we discussed, there's 7 teams that I think are very realistic playoff contenders. They're not going to get all 7, but I think there's room, to get several, even if those 4 from the Big Ten that we're talking about are all very good, because we know that there's 5 auto bids. The Power 4 all get an auto bid, and then a group of 5. That leaves 7 at-large bids. The SEC and the Big Ten are both going to get an auto bid, so that's 1 spot apiece. And then of those 7 at-large, I think it's really reasonable to think they could claim 6 of the 7. And right there, you got 4 qualifiers from the SEC, 4 qualifiers from the Big Ten, and then it's like, what happens to that final bid? Does the ACC become a 2-bid league? Notre Dame, do they get in the playoff, or is it Big Ten or the SEC claiming a 5th spot? I think it would be hard to do, but not out of the question, especially if Notre Dame has a mediocre season and there's clear-cut conference winners in the Big 12 and the ACC. Those leagues could be won and no more.
Yeah, I think it's kind of unusual. Of course, we have an expanded Big Ten. The SEC rarely plays Big Ten teams during the regular season. And this year we have LSU playing Southern Cal, also plays UCLA. We have Texas playing at Michigan. We have Alabama at Wisconsin. Those games are really important, I think.
Absolutely.
And another game that's important is Georgia versus Clemson. Whether the SEC gets 4 or 5 teams in could depend on the outcomes of those games. I mean, can these teams go in there and assert the SEC's dominance? Can Texas win at Michigan? That has a potential to take away a bid from the Big Ten. I think it will if Texas wins at Michigan. So those are, LSU, Southern Cal. Who knows how good Southern Cal will be? I think it'll be, it'll be talented. But if those games all swing the SEC's way, that could really enhance its chances of putting a lot of teams in the playoff.
No, I agree with you, John. Those games would be critical, almost like basketball. Those non-conference games give you a feel for how strong the conference is, and that's important when we're doing bubble talk. It's going to become more important in football too, those non-conference games. And as you mentioned, a loss in those games on either side will penalize that conference. It doesn't necessarily mean that the particular team that loses is going to be knocked out of the playoff. Like if Michigan were to lose at Texas, they could still get in the playoff. Or if Clemson were to lose to Georgia, Clemson could still win the ACC. But if Clemson, gets smacked around by Georgia and then wins the ACC, you're left wondering, how good was the ACC?
Sure.
Right? So,
yeah,
it can almost work to your advantage if you're the SEC. You beat one of those teams and in a non-conference game, and then that team goes on to win its conference championship, right? It really makes that conference then look weak, and could open the door for the SEC to get even more at-large bids.
Well, you go back to those LSU Florida State games.
Mm-hmm.
Those games were noteworthy. They were very significant. Really, when you look at the national picture, they were as impactful as conference games. And I think games like that become more impactful now because it used to be you're looking at winning your division and getting in the SEC championship game. I don't think without question that coaches look at it as now getting in the playoff, that's what matters. As you said much earlier, you could be in pretty good shape if you're the third team making the play from the SEC to make the playoff. Sit out the SEC championship game. Don't have to slug it out with possibly a number one team in the country, and be going to the playoffs better rested and maybe healthier.
All right, we will leave this here for now. I'm sure there will be plenty more preseason rankings come out in the weeks to come, and we might take a nibble at those as well as we continue to proceed throughout the off season and progress toward the spring meetings, which is Memorial Day week, and also SEC Media Days, which will be in Dallas this year in July, in a welcome of Texas and Oklahoma joining the conference. John and I will be with you each and every week throughout the offseason. Thanks for checking us out on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.